Today's Green Thumb stock analysis, or GTI stock analysis, is going to take a look at one of the largest multi-state operators in the United States. We also refer to those as MSOs. That's the acronym for multi-state operators. Now, you're probably already familiar with the bull thesis for cannabis. This is a chart taken from Green Thumb Industries, and cannabis, you see there in the center, reflected as $100 billion. In the footnote, they say this reflects 2030 projections. Well, actually, this reflects the current state of the cannabis market in the United States, both legal and illegal. So the black market has been around for a very long time, and it's actually one of our concerns that there are pricing pressures there, and you see this in the state of California, where the black market is still thriving, even though cannabis has been legalized. And then you see other sin categories here, beer and tobacco and spirits. So we know that there's a large market in the United States. It's the largest across the globe. And one of the reasons investors are getting quite excited is the increasing support from the public for legalizing cannabis ever since the 1970s. You can see across both Democrats and Republicans that they're supportive of legalizing cannabis. Certainly there's a lot fewer violent crimes associated with cannabis than there would be for something like alcohol, for example. So here on the map, you can see where adult use is legal in the dark green states, and then you can also see where medical use is legal. And adult use, which is recreational, usually follows medical. For the longest time, there was medical in the state of California, and everybody had glaucoma or whatever the requirement was to get their certificate, and then pretty soon they just pivoted into recreational. It's quite interesting that these states that have medical, it's really a gray area there. But the yellow states, you could see, don't have any current program. So probably makes sense to consider legalizing, though that's nobody can really say when that's going to happen. And certainly cannabis stocks they'll receive a huge boost from that because they'll be able to operate across state lines and receive more favorable terms for funding, things like that. Now, when you go to B school, the business strategy professor will ask the class, what's the number one goal for every business? And people talk about revenues and profits and things like that, but that's not true. The number one goal for every business is to simply survive. So when we look at cannabis stocks, we're less concerned with those that are thriving, and we're more interested in those that look like they'll have a good chance of surviving the coming recession, because we believe, and it's actually transpiring, that there will be pricing pressures on the cannabis market as the big surge of acquisitions tails off, and now these firms need to start worrying about operating profitable businesses as consumers start to tighten their purse strings. So let's just acknowledge there's regulatory risk here with firms that are dabbling in a product that's illegal at the federal level, and look at the merits of them surviving. So there's a lot of downwards pricing pressure that's being put on cannabis companies, and what we want to look at are things like gross margin tracking downwards. There's actually a number of metrics that we want to consider when we evaluate cannabis companies in this context of survival. It would be their profitability, how much cash they're burning, cash on hand, their ability to manage debt. So it's particularly difficult for cannabis firms to raise money because of financing and the fact that banks are very wary about cannabis. And we want to pay attention to things like the pressures that they're receiving on margins and, of course, the margin of error. Now, when we look at gross margin trends for GTI stock, we've plotted that here. So that blue chart at the top there, that's Green Thumb's margins over time on a quarterly basis. You can see that they're starting to drift downwards. And below that, you can also see gross margins for Trulieve. That's a stock, the only cannabis stock that we're holding, and you read that from right to left. Look at how healthy their gross margins were in early 2021, and look at how they've declined over time. They're still fairly good, above 50% there, but they're on the decline. So that's something that we want to pay attention to. Now, Green Thumb and Trulieve have something in common, and that's both operate in the state of Florida. And there was an interesting tidbit. There's a research piece that accompanies this, and the analyst covered a lot of different things that I'm not going to talk about in this presentation. So you'll fare well to read both that research piece and watch this video, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this video along with some other comparisons that we've done, for example, Green Thumb versus Trulieve. But one interesting bit of information here is that Green Thumb plans to roll out these dispensaries adjacent to Circle K stores in various Florida locations. That's very interesting. And it's an exclusive agreement with Circle K where the retailer currently operates 600 locations. So that's a direct threat to Trulieve, which happens to command a 50% market share in Florida. They're quite dominant there. It's where they have their most locations. So this is an interesting little tidbit of information. Now, when we compare revenues between these two firms, on the left you can see Trulieve's revenues tailing off, and that rapid growth there you see was also supplemented by acquisitions, which has left a lot of goodwill on the balance sheets of all MSOs. And then on the right, you can see GTI's revenues. Now, pay attention to scale here. It's slightly off, but you can see that Trulieve has more revenue than Green Thumb. But for both companies, you can see that growth is sort of tailing off. And when you look across all multi-state operators, you can see that sequential quarterly growth. This is last quarter versus the quarter before that. You can see how they're not really growing much anymore, and some are even declining. And the statement below there, that's from Green Thumb Industries. It says comparable sales, that's for stores open at least 12 months. They have 59 of them, declined 1.6%. So they refer to this as price compression, and that whatever volume growth they're seeing or continued traffic is being offset by this price compression. It's consumers tightening their purse strings. An example we always use is if you take edibles, it can be quite good for productivity for some people, and if you're paying $15 for 100 grams of edibles, that's 10 doses. Just buy an RSO vial and you'll get 1,000 grams for something like $30. So ridiculous price difference there. And as consumers start to realize that they don't need to be buying top shelf products because there's a recession and they're wanting to control their spending, then these firms are going to take a hit. And that's one of the reasons why we want to invest in an MSO that's vertically integrated. That means they own their entire supply chain. Now, when you look at on the left here, this is from Trulieve. This is a nice little map here, shows where their stores are. See that big concentration in Florida? They have 105 stores in Florida, 21 there on the West Coast, and then up in the Northeast there, 23 stores. On the right here, you can see this would be Green Thumb's stores at 71, and those little stamps that you see on the map, that's where their stores are located. Now, we looked in the 10K to find where their licenses are predominantly, and Nevada would be the highest at 32, then Illinois at 21, and Pennsylvania 17. That's where they're concentrated. And of course, as we mentioned, they're moving into Florida. Now, what's interesting about Green Thumb is this table here, which shows the retail versus consumer packaged goods, where they're making products and selling them to other dispensaries. As I said before, we really feel that you want to be vertically integrated because that's going to allow you to compete better on price since you control the entire supply chain. It's also going to work quite well when legalization happens. So from that perspective, we'd prefer Trulieve, also that they have, a slightly higher revenues there. But getting back to Green Thumb Industries, you could see here, this would be their revenues and their profitability. They're a profitable firm, but barely. So this last quarter, they eked in about $10 million in profits, and they're feeling some pressure there. It ended this last quarter with about $150 million in cash against about $255 million in debt. So as long as they can manage that, remember we talked about margin of error, as long as they can manage that right around profitability, they'll be able to do just fine. But if they start to run into problems with cash, they don't have too much there. So when we look at the largest cannabis companies out there, That's what this table reflects. You can see Trulieve at the top, and we've covered that firm before. I'll put a link to that research piece in the description of this video. Then you've got Green Thumb. We talked about them today. We're not big fans of Tilray. We've covered that. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And then, of course, Trulieve, the firm that we're holding. And then you also have Canopy Growth. Now, just to conclude, we believe that United States multi-state operators present the best way to play the growth of cannabis because the United States has the biggest market. And for now, focus should be on survival as everyone's margins are being compressed and revenues are stalling, even declining. So generally speaking, cannabis stocks move in unison in reaction to major events. So trying to figure out whether Green Thumb is better than Trulieve, we like both firms. We obviously love Trulieve because we're holding it, but there's a lot to be said about Green Thumb as well. It's difficult to pick which firm would be the winner, but I think both are probably safer ways to play the growth of cannabis. And I've put up another video here that you might be interested in watching. Please click the Nanalyze logo, subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this today.